So I started doing some research on Soren Kierkegaard and his book, Fear and Trembling. And you see, what I've been able to ascertain is that essentially he begins by telling the story of Abraham and Isaac from the Bible, and how Abraham is what you might call the father of faith. And he begins to explain how faith is essentially synonymous and akin to what you might call passion, and how in order to act on faith, we must momentarily suspend our obligation to the universal so that we may fulfill our absolute duty to God. And you see, contrary to the belief of Immanuel Kant, Kierkegaard essentially was saying that there is an absolute duty to God that we must fulfill, regardless of what is perceived as moral or immoral in a universal sense. We must temporarily disregard our obligation to the universal, or suspend our obligation to the universal, so that we can act on faith. And like I said, he would say that faith is like passion, or rather synonymous with it. But you see, Immanuel Kant would say that essentially, in order for something to become a universal law, it must be good or objectively necessary in itself, without reference to any other purpose. But you see, therein lies the contradiction in Kant. Because you see, if I'm to give you an example, and I'm not saying that Kant was telling us what was moral or immoral. I think he was generally giving us a basis of how we should decide whether something should be moral or not. It was essentially a logical argument. But I believe that it was not necessarily logical, but fundamentally myopic or nearsighted. Because you see, I think morality is much more ambiguous than what Kant explained it to be. You see, he would say that if stealing is not universally good, or if anything for that matter is not universally good, always, then it should not be deemed a universal law, or essentially moral. So that would mean that it does not depend on the context, that morality is not ambiguous, and that it is what you might call concrete. And I feel as if this is what Kant was doing, speaking concreteness into the ambiguity of nature, into the ambiguity of reality in day-to-day life and ethics. You see, if somebody is starving, if they have a family to feed, I think that if they steal, surely this is morally justified, or in a way ethical. But you see, Kant didn't believe so. He would say that stealing is not good, so therefore it cannot become a universal law, and therefore it is never accepted, regardless of the circumstance. And he would also say that if stealing was a universal law and was accepted, that the idea of ownership would not be a thing. But you see, I would say, duh, of course. You can't have one idea without the other idea. This is how language works. You cannot have one idea without the other idea. You cannot have yin without yang, light without darkness, good without evil. Surely you cannot have stealing without the idea of ownership, because if you do not own anything, then someone cannot steal anything from you. But you see, these are merely ideas. This is not reality. And you see, this is what I think Kierkegaard was trying to get at, or at least this is my interpretation of it. I do not want to speak for him, of course. These are just my own interpretations and ideas, and if you don't agree with me either, well, that's fine. But I'm just talking. I'm trying to work these ideas out in my head, and surely, over the course of time, I will transform these ideas into something else, because I will deepen my understanding, but I am merely just talking, because I feel as if it is advantageous for me to do so because it helps me work out the ideas in my head. But I think what Kierkegaard was essentially trying to get at, or like I said, at least my interpretation of it, is that in order to act on faith, we must temporarily suspend our obligation to the universal. We must temporarily suspend our obligation to morality, or what is perceived as a moral action. We must make our own decision and act on our own free will and fulfill our duty to God. Because you see, Kierkegaard believed that we had a duty to God. And in order for us to fulfill our faith, we have to act on what you might call intuition to fulfill our higher duty, our higher purpose. And I believe this to be important because I think that the world is in fact beyond good and evil. There is always something in the middle. There is hints of grayness everywhere. The world is not just simply white and black and light and dark. There's much more to the world. There isn't simply just good and evil or moral or immoral. There are circumstances that play out where I think it is essential to act on faith and what you might call intuition, because I think that with our idea of faith here, I think that if we are to say that passion is synonymous with Kierkegaard's idea of faith, then I believe that intuition also seems to be synonymous with our idea of faith here, or our description of faith here, in this particular circumstance. You see, I think passion and intuition are somewhat inextricable. Because you see, we have this feeling, although it is beyond understanding. And you see, Kierkegaard would also say that faith is beyond the understanding of the universal. The universal is essentially the ethical, right? So the universal is the ethical basis. But outside of the ethical framework is faith, intuition, and passion. And this is inherently human, I think, to act on faith. Because in order to act on faith, we must temporarily suspend our obligation to the universal, to the ethical, and make our own decision off of our own free will. You see, I think the story of Abraham and Isaac is a story of free will. And it's interesting because it brings up the notion of predeterminism or behaviorism. And you see, there are people who believe that free will does not exist, that everything is predetermined, that there is a path that you are indubitably going to take, regardless of the circumstance, that everything that happens to you was going to happen, and that you do not have a choice. And you see, I think I have a problem with this. Because you see, even if we are to think of it quantum mechanically, right? If there are potentials, and you see, quantum mechanics states that reality is essentially unpredictable. You cannot predict velocity if you know position, and vice versa. You see, and even if we think about Schrodinger's cat is dead and alive before it is observed. You see, before we make the decision, there is an infinite amount of possibilities. But it isn't until we make the decision that what was going to happen is said to have happened. But you see, before the decision is made, there is an infinite amount of possibilities that can happen. There's an infinite amount of choices that you can make. And you see, my problem with not only predeterminism, but with notions in general and concepts in general, is that what we do as humans, as people, as intellectual beings with consciousness, with language, what we want to do is conceptualize things. into smaller and smaller categories. And you see, this is reductionism. But my argument is, if, let's say, you understand the idea of karma, the idea that we can only do, that we can only take action. This is the only thing that is possible for us, to move, to take action. You see, what we are doing on a day-to-day basis, on a second-to-second basis, is continuously making decisions, one after another. You see, within the span of 30 seconds, you have made hundreds and hundreds of decisions. Maybe you've realized that you were blinking, so you decided to blink consciously. Instead of it being autonomic, it became somatic in terms of your nervous system. You moved your fingers, you touched your phone, you looked over there, you looked over here, you talked, you did something else. You made an innumerable amount of decisions, an incalculable amount of decisions throughout the course of your day. But you see, you can generalize this behavior, right? And you can say that a person acts a certain way, that he has certain tendencies. But you see, and you can map out their general proclivities. But you see, these are still just merely ideas. You are conceptualizing the whole entire person and all of the decisions he makes on a day-to-day basis, which is an incalculable amount of decisions. And what you are doing is reducing him or her into a concept and into an idea. And this, I think, is essentially what predeterminism is and what behaviorism is. And it's a scientific notion. It arose out of science. The idea that man does not have free will, that we cannot make our own decisions, and that everything that we do is predetermined. But you see, I think quantum mechanics refutes this idea entirely, because it states that reality is essentially unpredictable. We cannot predict it. There's an infinite amount of paths that can be taken. And surely the predeterminist can make the argument to say that, well, even if there's an infinite amount of paths, all of these paths were already predetermined. So regardless of which one you take, it was already predetermined for you. Well, I'd say, well, so be it then. I don't think that's a good argument. Because if there's an infinite amount of paths that you can take, surely you have free will. Even if those paths are already mapped out. Because you see, if you make one decision, you're going to make another decision. And you see, this is a continual splitting off. And you see, I think what predeterminism presupposes is that your decisions are concrete. That you're going to take a particular path. But I think this is fundamentally myopic and essentially nearsighted, because if there is an infinite amount of paths, surely you have free will, as I just said. And you see, what I think concepts do is speak concreteness into the fluctuation of reality. You see, we are constantly moving. We cannot stop, even if we are to speak thermodynamically, and if we are to recognize the first law of thermodynamics, that all energy is not created nor destroyed, but merely changed. Everything is continuously transforming. And I think what the predeterminist is doing is disregarding the idea that the psyche can in fact transform itself. That you can in fact make decisions that are going to lead to different outcomes. And you're well aware of this, especially if you pay attention to yourself, and especially if you are disciplined. Because you will find out that if you continue to make the same types of decision, if your behavior is generally the same, you will basically get similar outcomes. But you see, even then, the outcome that you get from the past is not necessarily the outcome that you're going to get in the future. Although they might be somewhat similar and recognizable, it is not the same exact outcome. Because you see, even if we are to speak about it epistemologically, and if we are to recall on Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, the essay by Friedrich Nietzsche, where he said that man created knowing, this is essentially what we are doing. The idea of predeterminism and the concept of your life being predetermined is what you might call anthropomorphic. And it is still disconnected from the thing in itself, if we recall Kant, because it is presupposing that something exists by describing it with a word. But you see, words can never adequately describe reality. So therefore, regardless of what you say, it is not true. And you see, truth is essentially an idea. But you see, it's still a word. Everything that we say is disconnected from the thing in itself. We can never actually know anything, because initially we act off of sense perception, and then we turn that sense perception into a word in our head, and then we speak it into the world, and then someone else interprets what we say. So therefore, once we perceive something through a sense perception, say I look at a tree, I think tree, then I say tree, someone hears me say tree. There you go. That's already 1, 2, 3, 4 steps removed from the thing in itself. It is fundamentally anthropomorphic. It is human created, this idea. It is not actually what the tree is. And you see, even tree is just a concept. Everything is essentially a concept. Nothing is exactly the same. Therefore, your decisions are never actually the same. And therefore, they cannot be predetermined. Because what we are doing when we say someone has a specific set of behavioral propensities, what we are doing is conceptualizing their behavior. We are reducing it down to an idea of the thing. And this in no way is an adequate description. Because you could say that someone is depressed, but their depression is in no way the same as somebody else's depression. They have experienced different things in their lives. They might experience depression differently, have different symptoms, and think different thoughts because they are different people. Their depression is not one and the same, although we say that they are both depressed. But just because we say they are both depressed, this does not mean that they are both the same level of depressed, because this is still just an idea. This is a concept. We are reducing the person down to a idea so that it serves our understanding. And you see, I think it was Carl Jung who said something like, where understanding is gained, wisdom is lost. You see, wisdom has no end. Wisdom does not seek answers. It just simply observes. But for some reason, truth is always interested in describing the world adequately. And this always seems to turn rather quickly into dogmatism. Because once you have an idea of truth, it becomes an irrefutable canonical axiom in your head. And most people, when they develop an idea of truth, they immediately close their mind. And nobody else, regardless of what is said, can convince them otherwise. So I think this brings us back to the idea of faith, and how faith can never be understood. In the same way that God or the soul can never be understood, if we were to think about it epistemologically. You see, these are ideas, and they can never be conceptualized, or they can be conceptualized, but they can never actually be understood adequately, but they can be felt. And you see, this is what Kierkegaard was saying about faith, that faith is not something that can be understood by the universal, because it is something that must be felt. And I want to talk about this more, but for right now, this is where I'm going to stop. And I will resume again, probably in a day, and most likely the next day, because I want to expand my knowledge on this and continue talking about it. And I'm going to put that all into one video for you to listen to.